Hi, my name's David Franklin Catterall. I was born in East Melbourne on the 18th of December 1945, so I've just turned 78 years old. I was born in East Melbourne and was brought up in Preston with two siblings, both younger, a sister and a younger brother. I did have a great uncle who served in World War I, and my father served in New Guinea in World War II. So as a young fellow, I always had an affiliation with an interest in the military, particularly because of my father. And I did a bit of service with the cadets at Northcote High School, but that conflicted with my love of sport and playing football. So I gave the cadets away, much to my father's disdain. And he said, "You'll never get back in the army and all this if you ever want to." So I played football. I played junior football at Preston, in the Preston District Junior Football Association with a team called the Swimmers, which was affiliated with the swimming club with which I used to do my summer sport, which was swimming. And that was a feeder for two main clubs in the then VFL of Collingwood and Fitzroy mainly. And of course I was residentially tied to Fitzroy, so I played a lot of junior football at Preston Swimmers, and then in 1961 I went to Fitzroy under-19s, and I played there from 61 to 1963 when I made the supplementary list for the senior side under the coaching of Kevin Murray. And I played for those last 2 years of 63 and 64 under his guidance, and played a handful of games in each year in the reserves. Went back to the under-19s to try and get them in the finals, but that was not to be. So I then decided at the age of about to turn 19 that I'd like to join the army, because I was always interested in wanting to be in the army, but particularly as an officer. So I wanted to go to Officer Cadet School Portsea, and Dad was very not supportive first up of me going in under 21. Of course, I needed Dad's approval. I had to go for the interviews for OCS throughout the period of about September through to November, and he had to sign the papers for me to be able to do that, which was quite young. Anyhow, I made the cut. I got into Portsea, and I entered Portsea in the start of about, I think it was about the second week of 1965. And I had a 20-year career, and I rose to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel when I became discharged because of a medical condition or conditions, and I resigned my commission in 1985. But I did have a great time in the army, and I kept up my interest in football because after coming back from Vietnam, I went and was on the list with Russell Blue at Waverley in the VFA then, but I injured my right knee and I had to retire from playing football, so I took up golf. But I always had a deep interest in the football clubs, and of course right up to 1996 Fitzroy when they were disbanded, and that was a big disappointment. And I didn't want to follow the Brisbane Bears or the amalgamation of the Brisbane Bears and the Fitzroy Football Club. So I went into a bit of a quiet patch, and my first marriage ended in about 92. I left the home, and I moved here in 1996, and Williamstown was the local side, so I started to just go down and watched a few games without being aligned first up, but I was in the Williamstown RSL, so I was starting to get invited to come along to some of the games with some of my friends. I joined the Willie Footy Club, or was asked to join, with some friends who I used to have a few beers with, and I joined the 1864 Club. And that was we used to meet up in the Barry Round Room at the home games. It was a special coterie type club within the supporter group, and they used to meet at home games, and half-time they'd have snacks and drinks, and it was a club of about 100 and probably 30 or 40. And generally in the old grandstand at Williamstown, they'd look at the game from the Barry Round room, as it was known, which was a room at the back of the grandstand, on top of the grandstand, and that's where we used to usually hold the functions for the 1864 club. And then when the new stand was built, we now view it from up in the main room, but we have a small function at half-time in the rooms down at the back under the grandstand. But when I first started to follow Williamstown, the affiliation with the VF or the AFL club then was with Collingwood, who I have no love for, and I wasn't all that keen on that relationship, but I did follow them, and through that period, of course, they got a wonderful premiership that the Collingwood boys went on to win the AFL premiership in 2010 under Nick Maxwell. So there was a host of wonderful players who came up through Williamstown, and with the amalgamation of the Collingwood Football Club, much to my disdain. But when I graduated from Portsea in 1965, I went up to Bandiana near Albury Wodonga and graduated into the Royal Australian Army Ordnance Corps, which is a supply logistics role of the Army. And I was posted there in 1966 to an overhaul workshop of the Centurion battle tank, and they were upgraded and modified to a higher standard than what they had been when the Australian Army first purchased them in about 52, 53. And with the Vietnam War inevitably upon the country, because by then we had one battalion already in Vietnam in Benoit in 1965, and the tanks, although they were big and cumbersome and noisy and smelly, never looked likely to be used in Vietnam. But when the 1st Battalion moved from the Benoit province into Phuoc Tuy, where the Australians were for the next number of years, the tanks, and Australia being by itself, the tanks as a very formidable firepower platform were being looked at as being wanted to go to Vietnam. And me being involved in the overhaul and the modification program at Bandiana in 66 and 67, I was appointed the officer commanding of a store section to support the tanks when they were to deploy to Vietnam from the commencement of 1968. They got there in February of 1968. I arrived well before that to set up the installations that we needed to set up to support the tanks, and the tanks were unpopular at first because of what I said before. They were big, cumbersome, noisy, but they did have massive firepower, and it was up to the tanks to be proven in Vietnam to prove their worth. And in the early days of their deployment, they used to go about 30 to 50 kilometres away from our main base at Nui Dat, and we used to send out resupply via the Bell helicopters, but the tanks being tanks with their big parts and heavy parts, they were very, very heavy resupply of an evening to them, so we had to get heavier aircraft like the Chinooks to take out pieces of equipment such as the heavy tank pads, big clads of 8, I think it was 8 links at a time, very heavy. The road wheels, which are about that round, with vulcanised rubber. That vulcanised rubber was starting to come off because they were being operated in Vietnam far differently to what they were in Puckapunyal before they went. There was some unnecessary wear and tear on the two main wheels at the end of a tank, at the back end where the drive, like a sprocket, that's a final drive, and the front is an idler wheel. And they were starting to take its toll because they were either, like the road wheels, the specification was such that they were breaking down at a far greater rate of knots than what they did in Puckapunyal. So they were the type of items that we had to resupply of an evening while the tanks were out at 1 and 2 and 3 weeks at a time. So my officer commanding of the tank squadron said, David, can you put together a scaling number of parts that can be deployed with the tanks when we have to move outside of our fire support base at Nui Dat? And I said, yeah. So by the end of February and throughout March, we fine-tuned a scaling of about 1,500 parts that would support the tanks when they were asked to deploy. But that did become quite successful because the resupply was cut back of a night time and the parts were being generally provided from the forward bits and pieces that were deployed with the tanks. We also got involved in the main battle of Coral-Balmoral, and that's where the tanks, although there was only half the squadron size of what it was supposed to be, a squadron is 16 tanks, and by the time we got to Coral-Balmoral, we only had 2 troops, each of 4 tanks. And the 3rd troop at Coral was made up of the 2 main battle tanks from headquarter squadron, or headquarter, and the other 2 tanks of the 3rd squadron there were the 2 bulldozer tanks that were playing up with their hydraulics, so they became main battle tanks at Coral. So we really had 2 full troops and 1 made-up troop. And Coral had been belted from the first night we went in at Coral on the 12th of May, and we lost, I think, about 9 or 10 soldiers that first night. And then the tanks were called up because they weren't ever going to be called up. The commander of the task force, Brigadier Hughes, went on leave, and the deputy commander, who was a colonel, Don Dunstan, Colonel D.B. Dunstan, who finally became chief of the General Staff, head of the Army these days, he took over, and from his World War II experience at Bougainville in New Guinea, he called the tanks up. So the tanks moved forward on the 21st of May, and we took 2 days to get there, and we arrived at Coral, where we had all the troubles between the 12th of May when we got hit by the 33rd North Vietnamese Army Regiment and lost those people who I spoke about earlier. I think there were another 1 or 2 incidents of either rocket fire and mortar fire and other things that caused a few other people to become killed as well. But we started to build up our defences, and 3 Battalion moved from the Coral area across to another fire support base called Balmoral. And number 2 Troop, under the command of Mick Butler, his 4 tanks were deployed in support of 3 Battalion, and they had moved across on the day of the 24th of May in 1968, and they came across a big bunker complex and got caught up in a slight ambush, and one of Mick's tanks had some malfunctioning gun equipment, and the gun equipment was pretty important because it was the mechanism for its main armament of 20-pounder ammunition that was greatly needed in a defensive position at Balmoral. Anyhow, during that contact, one of Mick's tanks, in firing at the bunkers, had a malfunctioning piece of this gunnery equipment, and there was only one that I knew of in country, and that was where I thought it was up forward. And we did have, from the earlier contacts when the tanks started earlier in February, what I call a croc tank back at Newey Dat, and we were starting to take parts off that to make up for what we didn't have in our scaling. So I was led to believe that one might have been taken off of there and gone up in the overnight resupply, which I was just mentioning before. But unbeknownst to me, I thought I'd better get up, because if that's not there, I'd better get up there and find the one that I know is there. And anyhow, that's what happened. I flew up, we found it by about early in the afternoon of the 25th, and then it was a trouble to get from Catterall to Balmoral, because it was about 5,000 metres away. Anyhow, another officer of the squadron was in the forward headquarters of the task force, so he got me a little, what we call Bell Sioux helicopter, like the ones in MASH, those little bubble ones. So I jumped into one of those that was made available to fly across the 5,000 metres across to the other support base. I dropped it off at the Ramey repair team to be able to fix it up, and I scooted and scrambled straight back to Catterall, because there was no place for me to stay at Balmoral that night. And so the Ramey boys fitted the gun panel, and I couldn't get out of Catterall that night because of what was starting to happen. And there was lots of planes and helicopters and artillery and mortars flying around. So we had to stay, I had to stay in Catterall that night in the bunker that Eric Bishop had dug for himself, and I reckon it was the size of a ballroom. So I spent the night there in that sort of safety. But that night, Balmoral was hit at about 3 o'clock in the morning, and that was suppressing fire at Catterall, which I experienced. That's why I couldn't get out, so I had to sustain that. And then the next day, it finished about 5, 6 in the morning, and by the time they did the clearing patrol, the tanks and the infantry from 3RR, I think straight out in front of their position, found I think there was about 7 or 8 confirmed bodies, and the tanks were attributed to for massive more killings than the 7 bodies that were found, because there were drag marks everywhere. And so I just tucked that away in my little head for many, many years. That was in 1968. Then I got out of the army, as I said, in 1985, and I did those jobs in Toyota and ICI and all those other ones I had. Then I was medically downgraded, not because of PTSD, which I was probably with for a long time, but I didn't know it. My main problem was I did jump off a tank that was starting to catch fire, and I injured my lower back. When I jumped off, I fell straight onto the bones of my coccyx, and I was immobilised from that. And over the many years in the army, I always had back problems. Anyhow, I was downgraded mainly because of that, and so I got out of the army mainly because of all those problems. And anyhow, I got involved in veterans issues. I became the secretary of the Totally and Permanently Incapacitated Ex-Servicemen and Women's Association here in Victoria, and that was between, I think, 2004 to about 2011-12. I was then elected the president, and in that time I used to work with other volunteers in the office of the TPI here in North Melbourne, and sometimes we talked about what we went through in Vietnam, and one of the guys one day said about the incident that I spoke about at Catterall in 1968. And he said if it wasn't for the tanks, I wouldn't be here, probably most of my company. And he said the tanks saved our lives that that night. And I said, well, if it wasn't for me getting the fire control panel to the tank which needed it, and I, to this day, don't know. We had a talk about that when I was giving a talk about the tanks in Vietnam and how they were supported, which I've just mentioned. And he came up to me and said this that day. So I said, well, isn't that coincidence? Here we are now all talking about it 40 years after. So I thought that was just wonderful. So I wrote a story. I think in lots of ways by then I'd completed the post-traumatic stress disorder part of me that was diagnosed. And that was diagnosed in 2001 or 2. And that's when I stopped working full time and I went into veteran care and issues. And so from 2001-2, I didn't talk much about it. So this occasion and instance brought flashes back to, you helped a bloke who's grateful for the saving of his own life. So the coincidence of that, after that talk at the RACV club I gave, I modified the notes that I used for that address and wrote this article about, I called it The Luck and Fortunes of War, a Logistician's Experience. And that's what was submitted for the writing competition. And I got beaten by a lady whose article was about 5 pages shorter and about a crockery pot or something, but and I'm now down to able to confidently give talks and addresses about this instance around the article of the story that I wrote, of how the tanks who weren't supposed to be in Vietnam in the first place finally got there, weren't supposed to be at Coral Balmoral, but were used there, and then saved this guy's life. So I can talk confidently about all that now, and I do, because it's just a great therapeutic part of my life that goes back now to 2018, when 50 years after the battle, we being the battalions that were deployed forward, and the armour and the cavalry and the engineers, we were awarded the battle honours for Coral Balmoral. And in 2018, 50 years exactly and a little bit more after the battle in the May, we got awarded the Australian Unit Citation for Gallantry. So they are the big things in my life. I'm a very well-aligned Western Suburbs boy these days with Williamstown. A very happy relationship with a lot of local friends through the RSL, local friends and that who I drink with all the time, and the Western Bulldogs who are just up the road, so as to speak. So I've had a great affiliation with the football in the Western Suburbs since I've been here, now for over 22 years. For the 2003 grand final, they chartered a ferry boat across to Docklands, where the grand final was, and that was a great experience because we went over there expecting to win, and we had a celebratory trip back home and got off at Gem Pier. Very, very happy and very pleased with the win in 2015. And it was quite unique because it was a thing that they thought would be good, and there was light catering on the way. There was not much per head, but there was a bit of beer drinking and a drunk and a few other things, but not heavily. And of course, it was a bit different coming back, but no, it was a great memory. And as I said, unfortunate that most of it goes back to that alignment with Collingwood, which was a very successful era for the club, and they were great years, and the alignment with the Bulldogs was quite good too, but that fell apart later on as well. And Willie has been a great standalone club ever since the alignment with even the Western Bulldogs finished quite a few years ago now, and they've gone very successfully as a standalone club in the AFL, and they've won various different national premierships as well, I think, during that time. So it's not been all that bad, even without Collingwood and the Western Bulldogs. It's a great club. It's got a lot of history, and the best part about its alignment with Collingwood was we were founded in 1864 and Collingwood was founded in 18 something else, a number of years later. In the absence of lots of photographs over 20 years, these 7 medals, of which when I got out of the Army in 85, I think I only had 3. And they had been sent to me and awarded at the time of me earning them. And that was the South Vietnam Campaign Medal for 28 days in Vietnam, the National Medal for 15 years service, of which I did 20, and the green and white one is the foreign award of the Vietnamese government called the Vietnamese Campaign Star, the Vietnam Campaign Star. So these are clearly the most important to me, because being a logistician, you don't normally get lots of these, and they're usually for combat type engagement, and so I'm very proud as a logistician to have these awarded. Now, the first one is the Unit Citation for Gallantry, which was the citation issued 50 years after the battles of Coral and Balmoral, the top one being the normal size one, that's only a miniature size one. The Army Combat Badge is awarded for 30 days service with a Army Combat team or unit, and it's distinct from the Infantry Combat Badge, which has only the bayonet. The Infantry Combat Badge has a bayonet inserted between the wreath, whereas the Army Combat Badge just has the 2 crossed swords. So that's the difference, and this was struck up because infantry had the first combat badge, then this was struck about a year or so later, but to be awarded it, you had to be involved with a unit engaged in combat with the enemy for 90 days or more. And of course we were under command of the tank squadron for the whole year, and then many years after, the Vietnamese government, after the awarding of the Australian Unit Citation for Gallantry, different groups through the Defence Honours and Awards Committee pursued and were awarded the Republic of Vietnam Cross of Gallantry with Palm, and that's the lower one that was only awarded late last year, about August last year. So everybody in Vietnam got that, not everyone got that, and only about 3,000 got that. So I'm very proud of those ones, and they tell a story like the medals to me told a story as well. I followed my dream. I wanted to be in the military. I wanted to be an officer. I did that. On a couple of occasions, I wanted to get out because I don't think the pay was all that good, especially straight after Vietnam. Labor had come in, and Labor were unpopular, having curtailed, if not the Liberals had stopped or had started to reduce the commitment to Vietnam, and John Gorton had started the withdrawal, but Whitlam got the credit for it. So through that heave-ho sort of period, I think you've got to stick with your dreams and your objectives, and even though the money went off, and I did join nearly then TAA in much the same role as I had in the Army, and looking by then after Army aircraft spares. I didn't. I stayed with the Army, and by then I became what I termed myself as a 20-year conscript, because I wanted to get my 20 years up and do the best I could, go as far as I could, and get the best superannuation I could. So the 20-year bit was then my goal. So I saw that out. I became a Lieutenant Colonel. I was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel back in Melbourne, where my first wife loved it. We were supposed to stay here for 4 years, and I was supposed to have 2 or 3 postings in that time, and the girls would have got through secondary school. But that wasn't to be. In Malaysia, they'd bought a lot of armoured vehicles, and they wanted an advisor with an armoured background, hence the Vietnam experience. And a fellow officer was on a court-martial. He was to be posted to Malaysia as the advisor, and because of that hanging over his head, he was unable to go. I was basically ordered to go. I didn't want to go because my wife was settling down into a 4-year posting and was prepared to give me a bit of a benefit of the doubt if the girls got through secondary school okay. Anyhow, we went up to Malaysia. I got there in February '83, which was just after all the dust storms of Melbourne, because the day I was being farewell to go there, that was a dust storm. We went into a restaurant in Commercial Road in Prahran about 12 o'clock, clear daylight, and came out, a great big red scan. We thought it was Armageddon, but it was the dust storm. So I went up there in February '83. My first wife hated it. The kids had to go to school very early in the morning. I think they started at 7 because of the heat and humidity. They'd get home at about 2 or 3 in the afternoon. The Chief of the General Staff, then General Bennett, who I knew as a cadet at Portsea, my wife said to General Bennett, "I don't like it here, I want to go home." So General Bennett said to my wife, "I'll get you home and the kids," but he said, "I don't know whether I'll get David home." But I was sent home about probably close to 12 months later, and General Bennett, as I said, who I'd known from when I was a cadet back in '65, he said to me, he said, "You do have a black cross against your name." But all that, and having committed myself to the career, I thought, well, I'll just see out now the 2 years to go. So when the 20 years were up, I got out straight away, and I got some very good jobs from my army experience in logistics. I got a job 3 months before my 20 years were up. I had to take leave with half pay to take the job at Toyota. That got me in better stead, and I was headhunted to ICI. So I've got nothing to regret about my military career and what I did after it. I did get involved in change management, so I had a lot of jobs after I got out of the army, but that was when industrial relations were not very good in the outside world. So I guess I was headhunted for a reason to turn things around and get things, and I really never wanted to be a consultant, but in the end I thought that's all I've been since I've been out of the army. But then things started to catch up with me with the PTSD, and the downgrading of the back was getting worse, and so I just decided to get out of senior management and do what I had to do. But I then went mainly to the veteran cause, and I in the end became national president of the TPI Federation in 2012 to 2014. So I gave a lot back to the veterans because of what I had experienced in both my military career and how that was enhanced from a civilian experience in senior management of about 15 years. So it was a wonderful experience. So my life advice would be follow your dream, don't let it go, give it your best bet, and never look back and regret anything.